Okay, so welcome to my next part of the Speeduino tuning guide. And today we are going to look at startup, or first steps before we start up, and then the startup also, because that kind of is one and the same process, especially if you have a base map already. And again, as always, if you have any questions about this, if you need tuning advice, if you need tuning done, let me know on Instagram. The link for that is in the description. Otherwise, I hope this video will explain a lot of upcoming questions about starting your car with a programmable ECU, or rather with a Speeduino unit. In our example, we are using a Toyota Carina, which is basically a E90 Corolla with a 4AGE 20 valve silvertop engine. The issue with that is that there is not a plug-and-play unit for that car, so I used a 20-valve blacktop map and a universal Speeduino ECU. So I have to configure some stuff. I already showed most of the things that you have to worry about in the previous parts. So be it the engine constants, so settings, how many cylinders, setting up your injectors, etc. So if you don't know how to do that, or set your basic settings, let's say it that way, then please have a look at the other videos I did before this one. In this video, we are going to talk about what we may need to set as well, because this is not a stock, or not a totally stock setup. It's kind of different to the stock setup of the 4AGE 20 valve. And because I'm using a base map, and because with the parts that I showed before, we basically set up a base map for our particular car. And this is why we are just going to go through a few steps and then try to start the car the first time. I have reloaded a base map for this car, the car I had already running, so I know that it works. And I'm going to show you what I'm going to look at, what I'm going to adjust to get the car started. First of all, if you look at my Tunerstudio, I have a capture of my screen on the top. Then we can see all of our gauges that we probably are going to need, which is engine speed. Throttle position is, in my case, not that important because my TPS doesn't work. That is not really needed to get the car started. And then I just have battery voltage, because that can come in handy if you diagnose, for example, a not starting issue, or for example, if the car starts only when you let off cranking, when that can be an issue of the battery voltage being too low when you are cranking, for example. That's a sign that your battery is probably going to be pretty bad. And also I would recommend get a good battery for this operation, so at least for the first startup, because we are going to have to use that battery now a bit, and therefore you want to have a good one that is working properly and that can supply power for a good amount of time. Then we have injector duty cycle. That is not really needed 100%. We have engine map, so we know our map sensor is connected. In our case here, we see that our map is 26, which is wrong because our engine is not running. I have to configure that. We have an AFR gauge. I would personally recommend installing an AFR gauge before you do any tuning, because this can also help with first startup and diagnosing startup, if you even get fuel or whatever. And maybe if your one cylinder isn't running correctly and stuff. So I would recommend getting that wired in also, and wiring that into a port or into the car, so that it does not turn off while you are cranking. On some pins, if you wire it into the radio, for example, on some cars, then when cranking, all the other electronics turn off. And that's something you might not want on an AFR gauge. Then we have coolant temp, because that's one sensor that also has to be working, so that we get proper measurements when we are, for example, when we are cranking the car, when you try to start the car, for example. And we have gamma enrichment. Gamma enrichment is basically how the ECU corrects for fueling. For example, if the fueling would be normal, gamma enrichment would be at 100%. If, for example, our lambda or AFR gauge or AFR sensor or lambda sensor would correct for fuel while we were driving, and it would correct for 10% more fuel, so in theory our car would be running too lean, then the lambda sensor automatically corrects our fueling. For example, if it goes up by 10%, it would show 110% gamma enrichment here. So just so you know. So that percentage value also adds up depending on what you have set on cranking settings, warm up and after start enrichment. So first of all, going for our settings, again, in our settings that should be all set. So if you have watched my previous videos, we talked about everything there so that you have everything set up hopefully as your car is set up, or as your wiring or as your ECU is set up correctly. I just have to do one thing and set my ignition to sequential in the ignition menu, and then I have to reconnect my ECU because it wants a power cycle, and then I'm pretty much done for this. Okay, then we have to do our sensor calibration, because that's pretty important, especially for the coolant and map sensor if we run map based fueling. For that we go to tools and first of all calibrate TPS if it is working. If it is, then go off the accelerator pedal, click get current, and then go full throttle and get current. Then there should be two different values around here that you should have, and then click on accept, and then you should have a correctly functioning throttle position sensor. So depending on how much you press on the accelerator, it should move smoothly on that percent value. But that is not that important to make the car running. The TPS sensor is though helpful for a lot of stuff to get the car running perfectly, so I just have to install that later. But it's not necessarily important for startup. What is important though is the pressure sensor, and in my case we have a the map sensor is a 4-bar map sensor, which is the MPX H6400. That's mostly shown on the spec sheet of the ECU, what sensor that is, and we are not using a barometric sensor for now. So we have a correct map sensor value now, 99 kPa, that's okay. And then we configure temperature sensors, because as I said, our coolant temperature sensor has to be correct to get the car working correctly. My sensor is kind of weird, so I don't have really a good working sensor, but it shows my temperatures somewhat correctly, so I'm not that worried about it. So yeah, in theory there would be the option to use to configure two different sensors, which would be one coolant temperature sensor and air temperature sensor. Most importantly, that is the coolant temperature sensor that is more important, because all of the startup settings, all of the startup fueling, etc. are calculated by the coolant temperature. So that needs to be correctly configured, at least somewhat correctly. Then we can select what sensor we are using, a 3-point therm generator, so 3 points of temperature and resistance. Then we can select a preset. For example, a lot of Miata guys or some other people use GM sensors, for example as IAT sensors, or even as CLT or coolant temp sensors. There are also presets for Miata specific ones. In my case, I just am using a Toyota. One would be wrong, I think. Yeah, that would be wrong. But I know for a fact that we are at... Again, my temperature sensor is kind of weird, so I'm setting some weird ohm resistances. You can also go off of measuring if you have, for example, a 1-pin coolant temperature sensor, measuring the 1 pin the resistance to ground, so to your chassis for example, and then you would get an ohm value and you could put it in there. And if you know, for example, what temperature it is outside, then you can put in that temperature, and you have your first point, and then maybe run the car to operating temperature, which would be around 95 degrees or something, or maybe 98 until the fans turn on, and then get again the resistance, and then you would know where the 98 or so is, and go off of there. But in my case, I'm just going to do it that way so that we have around 70 degrees right here. So the next thing we want to do, as I said, we have set our trigger wheel correctly, which we've done, which we've discussed in the previous videos. For first startup, you don't really need a timing light. I would highly suggest one though, because you're going to need one anyway later. And you are going to look at the trigger setup anyway. So yeah, just look at if you can get one. It will be important later to determine the correct ignition cycle, or the correct ignition in general. So now what I would also recommend, don't plug in your fuel injectors, or rather unplug them, because we just want to see if the car gets a crank signal or a signal at all. And then the engine does not inject any fuel, and we can see that. For that, we are just going to crank the car over. We have to watch the engine speed now. If it shows RPM, or if it shows us any RPM value, that's already a good sign. That means the crank signal is seeing some kind of signal, the crank sensor. Okay, that's a bad example because my car is now already running, even with the base map. So that's a pretty bad example, because that base map I downloaded is pretty good, but you could see while cranking I was already getting 300 RPM. And that speed, that crank speed, is important to see what you are getting here, because if it has anything else than about above 200, I'd say, so if it is like 500, 600, 700, even more, then that is kind of weird, because that probably is going to be, or has to be, lower. And if it is lower than that, for example 100 or something, then it's probably also wrong, and it has to be something else. And that could have to do something with either in the trigger setup, so you'll have to redo your trigger settings, for example. So maybe select a different trigger speed. For example, if you accidentally selected crank speed, but your trigger wheel is only on the cam, as for example it is on the 4AG E20 valve, or generally in the 4AG engines, or if you, for example, selected a different method, because in my setup a dual wheel trigger would also work, though it wouldn't work as reliably as a missing tooth. Although this would probably be considered as a multi-tooth or a dual wheel setup, it also works as a missing tooth, and therefore it works better as a missing tooth. But you probably may have to experiment around with that and maybe see, if your engine is relatively popular, what other people have selected here. That's kind of a bit of trial and error. And yeah, something else that can be hit or miss is the trigger filter. You have to experiment around with that as well. Sometimes a different value than it is than medium or off might get you different RPM results, because you may have some different values or different currents within your wiring harness interfering. For example, if you have a very old wiring harness that might be brittle in some parts, then for example a ignition harness or ignition wire might be interfering with the trigger wire, and then you can set your trigger filters up so that they are more or less aggressive. In my case, medium works quite well. I have used that on the Miata as well and did not have issues until 8K RPM, so that's not an issue for me. If you have issues with starting or with the car starting up like kind of weirdly, so it is sputtering at first and then just catching up, then you might have to set skip revolutions to 1 from, if you have, for example, selected 0, then it will start later, so it will crank longer, but it will start smoother when it starts. That's not an issue if you have a decent battery, and can even be a bit better for oil pressure, because the engine has more time to build up oil pressure. So, alright, that's basically it. As you could see, my engine starts already. If you, for example, don't have any RPM here, then that may be an issue with your sensor, for example, or your wiring. You could also go into the diagnostics and high-speed logger and select tooth logger. That only works if you have the full version of Tunerstudio though, and click start. If you get any signals in here. There you can see the trigger signal that I am getting. So in this case, those are basically the tooth that the sensor, the crank sensor, or in my case the cam sensor, are seeing, and therefore what you are getting. If you don't get anything here, then there might be an issue with your sensors, or with maybe your wiring, or maybe if you are using VR sensors, so reluctance sensors, then and your ECU does not have the right or the correct board to convert the round curve of a reluctance sensor to a Hall effect sensor, so a square curve, then that might be the issue, and you would need to use a Hall sensor or add that particular board. I hope I explained that correctly. But if you are getting teeth here, then it's probably the trigger settings that are set up wrong, and that's where you don't get an engine speed logging. If your car does not start, and you have set up the trigger setup correctly, so you are shown RPM, then it might be time to look at your trigger angle. So if nothing is happening and you are definitely getting fuel, and the trigger angle is, again, as I said, if your engine is at top dead center, and for example, the engine is at top dead center, so the engine is here, and for example, your crank sensor is here, and there is a tooth before the crank sensor that sits here. The amount of degrees that the first tooth has to travel to get to the sensor, that is your trigger angle offset, or trigger angle in degrees. On a missing tooth wheel, that is the missing tooth, that is the degrees that are accounted for on there. So you have to calculate that, or rather just use a degree wheel or whatever, just print that out, and then you can see clearly how many degrees it takes to get the that tooth or whatever to the correct position, and that's the value you put in there. If you are not sure about your correct trigger angle, there's also a way to get the car started and assume your trigger angle. So that's going to be, first of all, while trying to crank the car, advance the trigger angle or the trigger offset 30 degrees at a time, and by that you are trying to start the engine at different timing levels. And if you advance it at 30 degrees at a time, so 30, 60, 90, 120, 150, 180, 210, 240, 270, 300, 330 and 360, at some point the engine should be able to start, because it is close enough to a reasonable ignition angle, or a reasonable ignition advance, so that it will be able to start, and or at least fire. And then from there on, you can obviously, or you should obviously, use a timing light to adjust your timing accordingly and precisely. And that's also one thing, if you have the precise trigger angle and you know it, even though you have the trigger angle or trigger offset that should be correct in a theory, it is not always a given that this has to be correct. It could always be off a few degrees. So I would always suggest so that you adjust it to the correct value while using a timing light. I'm going to show you how that is done in the next video, because that is going to take longer than we have time for in this video, since I don't want to do this for too long. And yeah, so much for that. Again, if your engine doesn't start now, then obviously there's not enough fuel maybe. And that's where the cranking fuel priming pulse width comes in. And obviously the VE table, which has to be configured something like the VE table I showed you in the videos. So obviously it has to have some fuel down here and up the top here as well, so that the engine does get some fuel. In theory, it should be somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 or so to be in the range of most engines to get the car started. And for example, the cranking fuel is, for at least the injectors I have here, which are below 300 cc's, is like up to 200% maybe, but that's only like at a yeah, at very low temperatures. If you have larger injectors, the cranking settings can be a bit lower, because obviously on a higher percentage basis they are opening the same time but letting in more fuel, so you may have to correct that downwards for different injectors. There are some other settings you can try around with, for example the spark settings, and set up the cranking advance angle, so the degrees of timing or the timing advance the engine is set to while cranking, and that makes the car easier to start. And there are also on cranking settings some options to tweak to get the car running better. Cranking RPM isn't really something I would touch in theory. Again, this would be somewhat over your cranking speed. So the speed you see here, if it is for example 250, you should set somewhere between 300 and 350 here, so that the engine knows when it is outside of the cranking window and should start injecting a different amount of fuel and not the cranking fuel anymore. The other option or other things are to check if your fueling is correct is start with less fuel than you might think, and then try to go up from there. If, for example, your car is already making some noises, I don't know if I can demonstrate that right now. I gave the car some gas now and it was able to start easier. That was because the car was getting more fuel than it needed, and because of giving it gas, you can also see by my AFR, I'm running 0.73. Yeah, there you go. I'm running 11.0 AFR now, which is very, very rich. So you can see I am pretty much running very rich. So by increasing my throttle input, I was giving the car more air to the higher fuel mixture that it was receiving, and therefore it was easier starting, or starting easier. And that's why I tell you, or I'd rather tell you, to start with less fuel rather than more. Okay, so I'm going to shut off the car again. As you can see, this was starting on a base map, which, well, works relatively well, although the car is running very, very rich. Yeah, so the car is running now. Again, if you have any trouble starting, just let me know in the comments below. I can always give you some tips or whatever. As for the spark table and every other table I showed you in the last videos, if you have not watched it or if you have any problems, maybe watch the other videos I did first before you try to start your car, because I show a lot of tips on there, or a lot of things to how to configure your base map to get the car running properly when you first try to start it, or rather configure your base map so that you are at a point where you will be off relatively well when you try to start your car by your own. Obviously, you might find a base map for your engine that works, which would be perfect and obviously the most practical solution, because in most cases those base maps are going to get you very far as starting up your car, but in some instances that might not work, and that's why I do these videos, so I can show you what you can look out for, and you can also ask questions if I did not show something in the video what you might want to know, or what you might or you should have known, or whatever. Anyway, that's it for this video. In the next few videos we are going to look at fuel tuning, especially when it comes to the different options you have on a spark tuning, idle tuning, startup, and so forth, and so on and so forth. And with that, I wish you a nice day and goodbye.